Okay, we are recording now, and I will just mention for those that watch this later, this is the Arts Investment Guidance Subcommittee meeting, and we just collectively made a decision or a reminder that in the future, if the administration makes, the mayor's administration makes a decision about anything along the way here that is not necessarily consistent with how the AC3 feels or their recommendation, that we would be really careful to not characterize that decision as being a recommendation of the AC3 in case it happens to be different. So we'll be mindful of that moving forward. Okay.
And that kind of means, does that mean kind of voting on more things? More decisions, more directions, so that there's some, I don't know, some record of general consensus. This is how the committee says this should proceed. And then if it proceeds differently, then that activates, you know, the concern that Amanda mentioned.
Yeah, if that's how you all want to do it, I think that's fine. As long as there's an understanding that, you know, it's ultimately the, you know, the mayor's call. But if you would prefer to vote on things more often, that would be fine too. Okay. All right, so let's dive into what we wanted to cover today, an update on the Percent for the Arts Amendment, talking about how we're going to, you know, sort of divvy up funding moving forward. And if we have time, getting into a draft of what Annette has put together for the application. Okay, Heather, I'll turn it over to you. Do you want to give some quick points on our progress on amending the ordinance?
Yeah, so we are now looking to get to the March City Council with the amendment. The deadline for that, for us to submit that, to kind of go through the process internally, is tomorrow. So we are meeting with some staff this afternoon just to really finalize the final language for it. I think we've kind of gone over, and I sent a summary of the changes that were proposed as part of the amendment. The big gist of it is that we want to allow a certain portion of every year's Percent for the Arts funding to go towards non-capital art, and that to be recommended by this group and then later the Arts Commission. The update that we want to give you guys is that currently in the existing legislation, there is a requirement for 25%, a minimum 25% every year to go towards basically capital art. And so that is going to remain in the current amendment that's proposed. That would remain in effect. So we want to make sure that that's on your guys's radar and discuss any feelings you have about that. What that means is that this group could decide each year to dedicate up to 75% for non-capital art. Yeah. Any thoughts or questions?
Well, I don't have really a question about that. I think that's wonderful if that's cashless. But my question is, for administering this, well, quote unquote grants or contracts with the city, where does the money come for that? For like, I'm just concerned about where the money's coming from, the administration part of this. Is that coming out of that money? So that's my question.
Yeah, I think we can, that's kind of part, we're going to move into talking about that, right, Kevin? So maybe just before we move into talking about that, I just want to say that, you know, this is all contingent on City Council review and approval and adoption of the amendment. It should be at March City Council. We can send out the date for that in case any of you are interested in attending that. Yes. Oh, and also the reminder that anything that gets designated for non-capital art would have to be spent within that fiscal year. We just want to continue messaging that, because that does make it a little more time crunchy in terms of, you know, whatever money you recommend for non-capital art, it would have to be spent by the end of the fiscal year. So I'll pass it back off to Kevin to kind of start talking about what Thomas brought up.
Okay. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, we've had some conversations both with folks internally and the mayor's office and the mayor himself, and with the co-chairs of the AC3 in recent months. There's lots of different options on how we can do this, but I think we're kind of narrowing down to a suggested path forward for how we would administer these funds moving forward. So just to recap, in this fiscal year, which is last July 1 to this June 30th, that's how the city does their fiscal years, we have $236,000 available through this program, through Percent for the Arts. And we made a decision last time we all met that we would, of that 236, we would put 36 towards the Arts and Cultural Plan, or the Creative Community Empowerment Plan is the name we've been using. And that we would also search for money from other organizations, possibly the county, possibly the Community Foundation and others, to help round out the money needed for that plan. So that's 36 out of the 236. And that the remaining 200,000 in this fiscal year is exclusively capital money, or it has to be physical public art. But in future fiscal years, starting July 1st, a certain amount of the pot of money that we have next year could be used for non-capital art, and that's what the Arts Amendment is for. So we're kind of simultaneously talking about what to do with this first $200,000, and then what to do with next year's. Again, it's going to be the same number. It's going to be 236. So what was talked about in recent meetings that we think we have some support here at City Hall for the idea that Blue and Sean have brought up of having Wall Therapy administer some of the funds to do a mural program for part of the money, with keeping in mind that, one, they have some experience doing that and they're a good partner, and I think everyone really loves the work they do. Two, one of our biggest challenges right now in this whole program is that we don't currently have staff dedicated to administering these funds in the form of contracts to do public art. And my colleagues that have experience doing this and actually getting a piece of public art done and working with an artist to do that, emphasize over and over just how much time it takes to manage it on the city side, to manage that contract. There's all the paperwork, there's the solicitation of the artist, there's refining the proposal, there's getting the thing installed, ongoing meetings with the artist and that sort of thing. And by the end of all that, it's a pretty intense amount of work, and we don't currently have staff dedicated to that. Every department is really strapped right now. So we are entertaining, at least in this first year, contracting with an outside organization to do the administration of these funds. So the suggestion was brought up again through Blue and Sean that Wall Therapy be given administration over 100,000 of the 200 that we have available right now to basically develop a mural program. And we certainly have an openness to that. There's some details to work out, but we want to kind of talk about that with this group to see if there's some agreement that would be a good idea. So even in that scenario, if Wall Therapy is administering this, first 100,000, the city would still have involvement because we now have a contract with Wall Therapy. And also keep in mind, different than a lot of the work that Wall Therapy has done in the past, this program is for public art, and it needs to be on public property or in the public right of way. And that gets a little bit trickier when it comes to murals. There's a lot more options for doing murals on private property than there is on public property. So this won't be as easy as work they've done in the past. But we can work through that. So in that sense, that's why the city would still have continued involvement with whatever muralists they hypothetically work with, to make sure that it's done installed in the right way, and there's lots of details to work out there. So put that to the group, Blue or Sean or Thomas, if you want to add anything to that as a suggested use of 100 of the $200,000 that we have right now to work with. And then we could talk about the second $100,000 after that.
Or before we get into that, Heather, you mentioned a few minutes ago that the money that's distributed would have to be, I think you said, spent by the end of the fiscal year. Does it have to be spent by the end of the fiscal year, or does it have to be distributed by the end of the fiscal year?
That's a good question, and we can clarify that with budget unless some of the city folks have an idea. I do want to clarify the stuff that is the money that goes towards capital art, that rolls over year to year. The stuff the funding that goes to non-capital has to be put in what's called like it comes from operating expenses. And so that's why it has to be spent by the end of the fiscal year. However, I'm not sure, Johanna, do you know, does it have to be spent, or can it just be like awarded? Does it have to actually be out the door and allocated? Does the project have to be finished? It's a good distinction. Uh-oh, you're muted.
Sorry. Actually, I'm not sure. If we have a contract and an obligation, I don't know that it has to have actually been completed, but I don't know. I would ask you to ask budget, as you suggested.
Yeah.
That be absolutely right on that.
I would say, Amanda, that is an excellent question. And moving forward, time-wise, if that's the case, that money needs to be spent, that could actually put sort of a hold on what needs to be done, because you have to realize there's a season to actually be on a wall and doing things. And if that money's not spent in time, it may actually start happening in July. And now that fiscal year is already over. So we have to be very clear and specific with this due to the nature of outdoor mural making.
But it won't apply to that, Sean. That's considered capital art. It's only going to apply, that issue only applies to performance art, for instance.
Okay. So this year's money that needs to be spent.
Yeah,
it doesn't. Okay.
Well,
okay.
and also to clarify, the first 236,000 is capital, and so that rolls over. So you don't have that issue with that first round, right? It's for fiscal year, for the next 236,000 that we have for fiscal year 22-23, whatever portion you guys recommend putting aside for non-capital art, that would have to be, see, now I'm going to be careful because I'm going to actually reach out right now to budget to see, I'm going to message them and see if I can get an answer while we're still on this call, so that, because it is a very important distinction. Thank you for asking that question, Amanda.
Right, but in any case, it applies to July, this coming July through the following June. And whatever percentage or portion of that 236 is recommended and decided upon to put towards the operating side of things. And again, operating meaning performance or experience-based art as opposed to physical art.
And
that's the time-sensitive stuff.
And then, so would that also make the $36,000 that we agreed to in the last meeting that would go for the
plan?
The plan, does that mean that has to be either spent or distributed by June this year?
It doesn't.
Because it's non-capital funds.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is sort of a loophole here, or an anomaly. We have sort of a way around that rule for capital money, that we can spend that 36 on a plan, which is not a physical piece of anything, right? If that plan includes a master plan for how to do public art in the community in general. So we have sort of a workaround, an allowance to spend money on non-capital funding for a plan.
Okay, thank you. The nitty-gritty wonky questions, but I was looking for answers to those before we move down to the next thing. Yeah,
definitely. Okay.
And I think you were saying that we're going to talk about, Blue and Sean, we're going to talk about wall therapy.
Yeah, anything to Blue or Sean, anything to add to how I laid that out, or Thomas?
I think for me, at least, I think that we were wondering what the hard and fast restrictions were that were coming from the city, in order to then go back to wall therapy and say, hey, can can this work for you? It sounds like you all feel like we're generally in the same ballpark with what we discussed that time. But I think, you know, I had sent out a couple emails asking for what the legal restrictions are surrounding this. Some of the details, like does it have to be a city-owned building, or can it be viewable from Main Street and everyone in the city will see it, but yet it's a privately owned building where that wall therapy mural can go? Like, some of those details came up, and I don't think we ever really settled on those parameters, which I believe are probably necessary to hear and see in writing first. Like, just a few of them. What are the hard and fast rules that the city will have regarding this, so that we don't then surprise wall therapy with a new restriction on what they typically do? Because we need to get this into their wheelhouse, what they do well and fast and efficiently, and with all of our admiration. You know, we kind of, that's the goal here, to make sure that we're putting this on their plate in a manner that they're familiar with, as opposed to, here's an opportunity for you, wall therapy, but you're going to have to change what you do. So I was real careful about that. I wanted to make sure we didn't have a disconnect. I never heard back regarding those guidelines from city, what the restrictions would actually be. I understand the broad terms of capital versus non-capital and which budget year and the general number of 100K, but we never heard back the specifics of what legal would require from wall therapy, or for example, again, like I've tried to approach this, a contractor such as wall therapy. They're the first in my mind, but I think there are other entities, other orgs that are doing this kind of work and are well suited to the curation and the administration of these. So not just wall therapy, a contracting organization.
Okay.
So I'm sorry if you were expecting something from me, but on that issue, and I guess I can make it real simple. Yeah, absolutely. The murals have to be on city-owned buildings, and that being able to view them from the right of way, yet they're painted on a private building is not a possibility. And that's because you have made an improvement to that private property, and we can't do that.
Okay, how about indoors versus outdoors? Is that a hard and fast? That came up as well, and we didn't have any answer.
Yeah, if it's inside inside a public building? I mean, like inside a library or something?
Yes, library,
yeah.
recreation center, anything.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. There's no reason why we couldn't do that. Yeah, absolutely.
I just had a quick question. We had sort of asked for this earlier. I don't know who we would talk to get this. Is there any way to get sort of these lists of city properties so they can be viewed to see exactly what's owned? I mean, just like, you know, there might be some of your facility buildings. There's like a few downtown that might be able to be done. So if we can get a list of those, that might help to feed what wall therapy can do. Sorry, Blue, go ahead.
And then I actually have a question about the on-site, being installed on a public building. I want to just, maybe remind us that we're also looking at, that we should be looking at neighborhoods that are really suffering, in terms of aesthetically, in danger of blight, just when we start thinking about, making improvements to buildings that are in neighborhoods where the owners of those buildings or the proprietors don't have the resources to keep it looking like Neighborhood of the Arts or Browncroft area or, East Avenue. And so, but yet there are fewer public buildings in those areas. We only have a library. We only have, a rec center, in that, in the Northeast quadrant. I'm thinking of in the Lyle Avenue areas. And so I'm wondering about first of all, where that rule comes from. Like, is that law, legislation,
Yes.
what it is? And I'd love to actually see it like in writing to see what it all looks like. And then I also to see if there is some opportunity to challenge that. And I'm also thinking about how we can think about creatively, if we're talking about perhaps installing something on a building, installing art on a building, but it
Yeah.
not being a permanent piece. So it doesn't,
Or
it
we're
technically.
talking,
Raina,
are we talking
Raina,
about sidewalks or bus stops or, yeah.
Yeah, we actually did discuss some of these things, if I remember correctly. We did talk about that arena where we could take over. That's why we look at what the city stock is. So we take a vacant lot that is on Joseph Avenue that is owned by the city, and we're able to do something. That's why if we take a look at the stock that's there, if we take a look at what the city has, we can make those suggestions. And correct me if I'm wrong, this is what we talked about previously.
Yeah, but so for example, though, the building, for example, that might be facing that lot, the community facing wall for that building, that wall therapy or a contractor like that would be working with is actually would be owned privately, right? And
Mhm.
so that still comes up a little bit if we're talking about, putting art on walls, if we
Yeah, but
still-
you have a temporary installation. So if
Yeah.
it lasts 2 to 3 years, you can have a temporary installation on that private property. I believe we discussed this with
That's
legal. Because we want to make sure, look, that's our whole point, Rita, is making sure we get into the neighborhoods and where it's at. Just like the call, when we sat down with wall therapy, we did stress what goes back to our original intent when we all sat down to say we're looking for people with disabilities, people of color are first and foremost to receive these grants, and they have to live in the city. Well, the stipulation, have to live in the city. Sorry, I just wanted to connect with you because I'm with you, Rita. I'm with you already. Got to make sure we're taking care of the neighborhoods that need to be taken care of. Sorry, I'm sidetracked.
Just to clarify, this money is not going to be spent on throwing up something that's going to last 2 or 3 years. We're not going to throw up a sheet of plywood on a vacant lot and put a mural on it. I don't think that's what's going to be coming out of this program.
No. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying there's creative ways to think about this.
Yeah, and also I'm really, really curious about like where these decisions are coming from. Kevin, I respectfully appreciate, the idea that you have, sort of a firmness around what you believe should be happening here. But I also would like to know who's making the decisions around these things? And again, do we have an opportunity to push back and challenge some of these, because some of it has resulted in an inequitable distribution of resources in our community, right? And so we have to kind of think outside of the box and also think about where we have room for improvement in existing policy.
Okay, Raina, let me just answer that because this isn't a policy decision. This is the state constitution, which prohibits municipalities from spending money and giving money to private parties. So that's why it would be an unconstitutional gift for us to make an improvement to somebody's private property. So it's not that we don't want to have public art in certain neighborhoods. We do, but we're going to have to find, and what I'm hoping is that when you get the full inventory of the city properties and also of course the right of way, and you know about the project that you're working on, that public art can also be in the right of way. So once we have that full inventory, let's start with that and see if we've got enough locations that we can put art where you want to see it. And if we still don't have enough appropriate locations, let's look at this issue again, because what can happen, of course, is if there's private funding, then the art can go somewhere on a private building. But it's just that the city's money can't be spent on private property because it's an unconstitutional gift of public money. So,
Yeah.
but let's start, I'm just asking, let's see if we can get you that inventory. And if we keep them out, there are firehouses as well as rec centers and libraries. So there are, and we got more buildings than you probably realize.
Yes, you do.
There are a lot of city buildings.
Yes, you do.
And I guess I'll say that in the event that a building is owned by, so yeah, I'm wondering about, yeah, like, for example, a building was torn down on the lot that we're doing the project on, and the city owned, I guess, the building and the lot, which is why they could tear it down, right? Are you referring?
Yeah.
So, I mean, are you referring to like if there's a standing building that might be owned by the city, but not you? I'm thinking about these neighborhoods because I'm in them all the time.
Right,
Like,
no, of course.
so I'm thinking about what I actually physically see, you know, all the time when I'm driving around. And it worries me, the idea that we might be limited to, you know, the few that I'm thinking of visually. But you're right. And then maybe there's some that I don't know about, you know, that are owned by the city and they're just sitting there, you know, looking crazy right now. But
Remind me, are schools in play, public schools in play with this?
Yep.
Yeah.
They
so we have
should,
schools-
yeah. I
schools
mean,
right
we own the
there.
buildings. We certainly would have to work with the district and but I think that's okay as well.
Just wonder if we could clarify this into a inclusive list of restrictions that are hard and fast, not some of these that are case by case. Because I think wall therapy and probably any contractor, maybe that's what Rena's touching on, like anybody's going to want to know what they're getting into, and they don't want to have a new restriction pop up halfway through. I mean, I certainly would feel that way about any project at Roco. So I'm wondering if we can just actually get in writing a list of what those restrictions are. And I think part of that is what Sean's asking for, the inventory of buildings, but also like in writing, it has to be a city-owned building, not a county-owned building, or, you know, any of those hard and fast things, like actually in writing, so that then we can understand how we can best be the art community advisors that we are.
County-owned buildings might be a possibility. I gotta think about that. I think, and you know, the other things, and this is where we're gonna have to get some, Kevin, some advice from DES and real estate, that, you know, there may be practical things like you can't put something that's gonna cover up a window, or, you know, you can't do something that would damage the surface of a building, or, you know, so that kind of practical stuff. If it's in the right of way, it can't obstruct pedestrian access, that sort of stuff. Is that some of the type of stuff you're talking about, or what else?
I mean, those are pretty clear, but I think Kevin also just brought in a question of permanence, and I don't know. I mean, I didn't think we were dealing with only permanent public art here, and murals are inherently, they're just not permanent public art, period.
True,
you know,
true.
I mean, if you look at wall therapy's map, there are some that have been around for years, but there's others that, whether through weathering or defacing, have only lasted a much shorter amount of time.
It's just the nature of the beast. It's not.
It's not,
Or
it's not a
John's
wrong.
the building blowing up and catching fire. Like sometimes it happens.
If those are permanency restrictions that the city feels the city needs to exert on this, then I think we got to know what that is. Is it 5 years? Is it 3 years? I mean, I think there are terrific projects around town that are painted on substrates that are not, that no one would consider permanent, but they've been in the community's minds for a decade, and they're contributing to our landscape in beautiful ways. And I don't think we want to exclude those just because they're not permanent.
Yeah, can I clarify what I said?
Yeah.
So what I was referring to was when Sean was talking about throwing up something on a vacant lot, that really gets into some impermanence that we have a lot more concern about. And clearly, as you said, murals on the side of the building, even the most high quality, durable installation is not really permanent. It's going to wear out over time. But I think those are all legitimate here in terms of how that money is spent. It's more of, if there is a lack of a structure in a spot where you want to put a mural and you want to sort of construct something in order to put a mural there, like that's possible, but the cost of building something there in order to make that long-term enough is probably cost prohibitive. Like I said, you could throw up a sheet of plywood and put something there, but that's probably not, I think, what we're looking for this program. I guess a concrete wall or something like that.
I was just trying to say, let's think creatively. That could actually be a shipping container that's welded shut, that can sit there for 10 years, that could be redone. Or it could be abandoned houses that the city land banks that you're holding on to, that you could actually paint the whole house green, which becomes an attraction. Let's think about other ways this can be done besides attaching something. That's what I'm saying.
Okay. I think that's definitely in play.
Yeah, and we
Well,
need space to leave that creativity up to the artists as well. You know, we need to, that's why we probably need to know all of the particulars and, you know, and figure out where there's room for creativity because, you know, yeah, there's more than plywood, as Sean is saying, you know?
So Kevin, maybe there is a figure that the city has in mind, like it has to last 2 years. I don't know, I'm just tossing that out there, but maybe that would be a hard and fast that would set this line for wall therapy and others to be thinking creatively on one side of it. And you're resting assured that it's not going to be, super impermanent, for lack of clarity on this language here.
Yeah, and Johanna, maybe you could speak to this, but I don't think there's anything, well, I shouldn't say anything. In all likelihood, things aren't going to come out of this program that are truly permanent. The closest thing to permanent would be probably a sculpture of some kind, which could come out of this. But I think this program definitely has space for things that only last 5, 10, 15 years. And on the operating, when we're using operating funds, which have to be used within that fiscal year, there's the opportunity to create things that are much more temporary in nature. Like the gates in Central Park many years ago, that was fully intended to be a temporary kind of rotating show. Madison Square Park, there they do all kinds of rotating art. I think that's in play with when we use some of the operating funds. But in terms of permanence of the capital stuff, typically it's meant to be like if we're bonding for, using bond money to create something, you need the piece of infrastructure or whatever you're building to last the life of the bond. And Johanna, can you speak to that? Is it like 15 years typically?
Yeah, 10, 15, 20 years, but that's for major, construction projects. So, and so we're not certainly bound by that length of time. This is coming from cash capital, it's not being bonded, but, and I don't know, what do you consider a reasonable time of permanence for a mural? And, we kind of be interested in, in hearing what you think it's reasonable time for a wall mural to last. How should we look at that?
Well, I think one other thing we should be thinking about is maintenance of the art. And so if we're, I think we'd be looking at, this is what the thing is, and this is how long it lasts, on its own. And this is what it would take to maintain it, over the period of time that we would be expecting to maintain it or refresh it. If it's something that doesn't, I don't know that permanency is always the best thing. Sometimes we want to refresh. We want to, to put a new message out there. We want to incorporate a new, a community of, the next generation of, of neighbors in that neighborhood to say what needs to, what should we be doing now? What should we be thinking now? What else would you like to see?
Yeah.
I wanted to, sorry, I just want to update too that we've completed the tracking the public arts investment tracker from the beginning of 2016. So the next step is to map that and to have that map alongside a map of city-owned properties. We can put schools on there too. And I think that will be a great guide for you all in looking at proposed projects and areas for projects. Sorry, Johanna.
No, that's good.
And while we're working on that, we're also going to be working on that request blue. We'll put that together in more writing, spell all those details out that we can think of that would be restrictions, because you're right, that's only fair to wall therapy, that they know exactly what they're getting into when that gets proposed to them.
I mean, and I personally would toss out there a lower threshold. We may be talking about capital funding here, but if we're including murals, I think we really need to have a pretty low cap on the permanency threshold, whatever that is. The nature of mural arts, being refreshing, being changing regularly, and bringing new vibrancy to the same place more than once in someone's recent memory. I think that's vital to the nature of the art form. Sean might have some other thoughts on what
There's
that,
just-
what that number is.
Yeah,
but-
there's so many variables that come into play. It's your substrate you're working on. It's weather conditions. You just can't call it. I mean, you're like Amanda said, you'll see things that are up for 10, 12 years, things that only last a few months. So I think this is where we really have to think about what that permanence, what that actually means. It's not going to be a hard skate piece. I don't know.
Well,
Just like that point you're
are
bringing
there
up, Lou.
So seems to me there's two issues. One, and understand what Rena was saying, and Blue as well, that the art may change because the neighborhood or the artist wants to make changes to the art. But the other part of it is the permanence of the art, because and I guess Sean, we'd like some maybe advice on this. If the surface is properly prepared and the right kinds of paints are used and whatever kind of coating or whatever is put over the paint or whatever protective covering, what is it reasonable for us to say that the mural should last at least 2 years, 3, 4, or 5 years? What is reasonable? And that's apart from whether the art gets changed for other reasons, because the mural's still there. That's not a problem. I'm just talking about it peeling off the wall. What is reasonable for us to require? And that's what we would put in our contract, saying, murals shall last a minimum of blah blah whatever years. What do you think?
I would go with what Blue was saying in this lower threshold. And since we're trying to engage a new stream of artists, a new stream of creatives in this process of creating work, that maybe they, with the budget that they're given, they may not have they'll have what they need, but they may not have enough of what they need. So I would say in this case, in this quick moving, to make sure that we can get this done, I would say at least 3 years. That's it. Excuse me, at most 3 years. 3 years.
Okay.
And then along those lines, I don't want to rehash something here, but now that we're talking about a lower threshold and the fact that these are relatively impermanent objects, are they really bringing value to a private property owner's building? I mean, that's kind of circling back on something you just said, because you're typically talking about something permanent, right? As lasting as long as a building, and you're adding all this value to it by installing it on a building. And if we're talking about something that's only lasting a couple of years, is it really bringing value? Are you really, I forget the language you used. Is it?
Or is
Good
it
try, Blue, yes.
Or are they gifting us? Are they gifting us the space? Are they gifting us a space to use as a canvas? I mean, there's other ways of thinking about this. Nobody's painted on my building yet, and it's going. I don't know if it's an improvement unless I'm saying, oh yeah, I like this idea, I like this project, and okay, I will allow you to.
Okay.
Well, I wonder.
I got a quick question. So you talked about money being spent, and money can't be spent on that. But if you're giving money if the money's being spent by wall therapy, isn't it to their discretion where the work needs to go, because the money was spent with you hired someone to do this? Does that money still?
Yeah, it's still city money going on private property.
Okay.
Please let us finish the inventory. See if we can make you happy with enough city buildings before we get into this any farther. Okay.
And I just want to say too that one of the things that's compelling for me in the discussion of use of public dollars for private property is if there can't be any indication that money that the city spent is somehow benefiting by increasing property value, benefiting a private property owner. And that's a compelling point. But yeah, to Johanna's point, we don't have to fall down this rabbit hole until
I don't know it's not always improving the property value. It's just not. It's not. I don't know that we're thinking about this the right way.
Yeah.
Well,
sometimes it's literally you're locking yourself into a painted wall, and you have to keep that up. This is the reason I haven't had paint put on the wall in the Ave. I don't have the funding to keep it up.
Yeah, it's actually an expense. It's actually an expense. And talk about, I mean, rest his soul. I wonder if Gary Stern would look back at the legal wall and say that was improving the value of his property there, Sean.
Can I just,
Right. I have a quick question. Sorry, quick question. Okay, since this is a contract, whatever, is there a way to loop this into when the city actually gives private owners money to improve the facades of their places? Is there a way to rewrite this so it happens that way?
Well, if there were, there are federal, if it's a federal or state grant, we don't have the same issue. This is because this is city money. You're making this so complicated for my poor friends in planning here. how you could combine, federal or state dollars to allow this. It's something we can certainly look into. This prohibition is against city money, not state or federal grant money, city money being spent on private property. So, it's something that we could look into. Oh my gosh,
Can I just offer something quickly? I know, Sean, we've even maybe 10 years ago, we were hot on that what we call boulevards, the program where we painted intersections. And we did a bunch in the Highland area. Like there's so much street and sidewalk, a surface area to paint too that could instantly enliven and brighten and engage people in their neighborhood too. It doesn't always have to be a wall, like because Rena said, like then we're limited to those couple art centers or schools or whatever, but it could be so much more apparent every few blocks if we use the intersections or use the sidewalk. So I would encourage you guys to think about that and not get too stuck in the weeds, because this is almost why we've had hard time spending this money, to date. Like,
so that means.
Yeah.
Sorry, Curtis. So that would mean we would have to change its permanence. That means we would have to say from 24 hours to 3 years. If we're going to paint a street, that's not going to last for 3 years. So that means permanence is very, very flexible in this case. So that we have to change it to 24 hours.
Can I interject for just a second? I'm sorry. This is such a great conversation. However, the time is kind of running out. And I think the step before this is the step of deciding who's going to distribute the funds. So I think, yes, we do need to get clarification on how the funds could be distributed. But I think before that, we have to decide on who is going to distribute the funds. And so then we can have a discussion about how they're able to distribute those funds. I think creating this list of the things that the city owns, the properties that the city owns, and then making also a list of what are the, right now, what are the restrictions for using city money. I think that's the place to start. Yes, we could probably figure out a way to challenge the use of our, how city money could potentially be used on something that's owned privately. But I think that discussion is after we figure out who's going to actually distribute this money and how that's going to work in conjunction with the city. My second point is in the amendment to the city council on this money, so that we can use it for non-capital things. Is it in there that this money would need to be, or these non-capital, for example, performance things, would need to be something for the public or put in a public place? Or is there any of that language, or is it a little bit vague as to how that money is actually spent? So that's my third thing. Sorry, my third thing is, even though I know many of us have spoken with some members of City Council on this subject, would it behoove us, which I think it would, if some of us actually spoke at that City Council meeting? If we signed up to speak at the City Council meeting, because I think hearing from the public, maybe not us actually, maybe it should be other people, but hearing from the public, I think, is not only an important thing in moving this into the direction we want to go, but it also, I think, from an optics standpoint, is also very effective and beneficial in the bigger picture. So those are my three things. Unfortunately, I have to go to another meeting at 11 o'clock, but I wanted to get that out before I had to go.
Thomas, I think that if we wanted someone to speak on behalf of this, who isn't in AC3, there are probably folks in Rock Arts United who would be happy to.
Awesome. Thank you for that suggestion, Thomas, and Amanda, to you too for offering that. I think as we get closer to that, I think we can do some kind of behind the scenes coordination to rally the troops, so to speak. I think that's a good idea. Yeah. And you're right, Thomas, we should, while we're putting together the sort of strings attached, if you will, or the guidelines around the money, we should also do the same for the operating funds side of it, the non-capital side of it, so that is clear as well. Even though that's not what wall therapy will be looking at immediately, but we all would need to be on that same page for those restrictions too. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up, Thomas. We do kind of need to make a decision without.
Excuse me. One quick second. I think while we're asking some of those questions, I don't know, Blue, you might want to chime in with this, Thomas, is because when we sat down with wall therapy, they wanted to know these things ahead of time. So even if we're saying we're asking them to do this, they're saying, I need to know what I'm getting myself into before I even agree to that. So that's
totally
why we're trying to ask these questions.
We're going to lay that out, but it probably won't be to the level of detail or the number of sort of iterations and scenarios that you're talking about here. We have to keep this simple to get out of the gate here and get more.
Agreed.
And as Johanna said, let us take a shot at showing just how many opportunities there are. And if in future years we want to work on the edges of that, we could do that. But in this first year, we gotta keep this simple and keep things moving forward. So is everyone comfortable in general the idea of let's just say 100 out of the 200 remaining, that we would engage with wall therapy with more detail on what that would look like and ask them if they're amenable to that? Any cautions or concerns there?
Sounds good.
So it doesn't have to be an RFP or anything that goes out. So that I don't know all of the people who would be qualified to do it. I love wall therapy, but I'm just asking the question.
Yeah,
and about equitable distribution of things and how we keep pushing for that.
Yeah, that's great. We should always keep coming back to that, Rena. You're right. So another thought that sort of ties in with this, at the risk of muddying it up a little bit, but let's talk about the other 100. Again, we're really struggling to find the staff capacity to manage these contracts and these installation of projects. The city will have some involvement, but the actual day-to-day management of it, we don't have the staff right now. So there is consideration of doing the same with the other $100,000. The mayor suggested, for example, the community foundation, might be a good candidate to manage the other 100, and it would be a non-mural program. Let wall therapy do a mural program. Let somebody else manage a broader public art program. And in that case, we could do the same. We could either agree that organization X is the right one to do this and just work on that with them. Or to your point, Rena, for this other 100, we could do that like an RFQ or an RFP process to find that other organization, because as Blue and you have noted, that there are probably multiple other groups in the city that in theory could do that kind of work, working closely with the city to manage that money. So that is a possibility too.
I just want to toss out there, for me, a key criteria here would be an organization that has experience working directly with artists. That's why I suggested wall therapy first, not to be the only, but just that they represent, in my mind, an organization that has commissioned a lot of public art around the community. So to me, that only makes sense, because that's the expertise that the city lacks, the kind of curatorial, and I know we've struggled around the word administration, but curation is administration, frankly. So it's a type of creative administration. So it's that expertise that is, I keep repeating this a lot, and I'm very vocal about this. There are experts in our community. I've mentioned wall therapy as one of those. And I think engaging with them, and that as the key criteria. They've worked with artists, they understand the lay of the land, understand the community, and are, administratively, fiscally responsible, all those kinds of things that the city should be most concerned with. But it's the is sort of the demonstrated experience working with artists directly in executing a program. To me, at least, it stands out as the key skill, the key professional skill that we're looking for here. Anybody agree with me or disagree with me on that?
I definitely agree with that. I do. I think you're spot on in that. And you know, the only reason I raise it is just to make sure that you know, and they because they have this direct experience working with artists, this is also some conversation that we can have with them to say that, you know, talk about who's actually, you know, getting, you know, actually getting those almost as if these are like mini grants that they're now, you know, putting out, or who or how we engage others, the community and different folks on what actually goes up on the walls too, you know, because it's really about engaging them around engaging wall therapy or a contractor like that on okay, this is you're managing the project. It's not, you know, and you're curating, but you're also curating the artists and the folks who are making the decisions about what's going up, you know. So yeah, I agree.
And I
And
think
it's a Brown-led organization.
totally. And when we met with Buffalo, just as our one, you know, just one example, I think I've been saying there are many, many. That's the missing piece here, that, you know, the city of Buffalo is not executing public sculptures. They're working with contractors who do this type of work and work directly with artists to execute on public art. I think, you know, we saw that pretty clearly.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. Hey, Kevin, I have a quick question too. You mentioned this earlier. I just want to make sure I understood it when you said it. You said that the capital funding carries over into the next year. Is that correct? So if we didn't have a solid plan for the extra 100, we wouldn't necessarily be losing that. It would just be deferred to the next year. And then maybe a follow-up question to that is, and maybe this was covered in an earlier meeting, I'm just not remembering. Where is there funding from previous years that has existed for capital projects? Or is that not a thing?
No, it's basically all accounted for. So we're dealing with, this group is making recommendations on 236,000 for this fiscal year, and the same amount for next fiscal year.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure.
Blue, I wanted to follow up a little bit on what you said. Is it your opinion that wall therapy is sort of uniquely able to undertake what we're talking about, this sort of to administer or curate, you know, work with local artists to do the wall murals, that there's really not anyone else in the community that you're aware of that has the skills that they do?
No, not necessarily. I think they are the first and foremost in my mind, but I think there are other entities that, you know, commission art, work directly with artists, and have, you know, demonstrated sort of fiscal responsibility, all the things that the city would want to, you know, have that, you know, oversight over and be assured. So no, I don't think wall therapy is the only, but if we were under a little bit of a sense of pressure. So that's why I just said, look, rather than us inventing a program that's administered by the city, which frankly, the city doesn't really do this kind of thing, let's get a contractor in who has a known experience with this and is well respected. And that's what kind of opened up the can of worms as to who and then who else after wall therapy. So I think there are many others, or a few others, but wall therapy comes to mind first for, say, 10 murals, 10,000 each, 100K, just down and dirty, real simple numbers. That was the suggestion, but we need to hear those parameters first so that we're sure wall therapy can actually say yes.
And then my question is, and I think as far as thinking about equity, if the opportunity is broadly promoted, I think it could be equitable, but I think it might be reasonable to put out an RFQ or an RFP, because I think that there are not only organizations that could do this, but I'm thinking of like, crap, I can see her face, so I'm not going to be able to pull her name. But artists who have studios where they employ lots of other artists to help them with their work, especially if we're thinking about sculptural works, public works. You know, it's large scale sculptural works are very rarely done by one artist. But that would be a public work. And if we were distributing funds for public works, I would be much more interested in, like choice one would be a group like Wall Therapy, who could take a large chunk of funds and then distribute it out to a whole bunch of artists. But I think that choice two for me would be an artist who was willing to employ other artists in the creation of that work, and who had a history of working with younger artists to help them gain skills and establish a career. So whether that be like what was done with the Douglas sculptures, or even some of what was done with like rock paint, even though that's not sculptures, that's murals again. Bringing in artists who are younger, who are less experienced, who could use some of that kind of mentorship, I think would be a beneficial way of looking at spending these funds, versus, not that Paley Studios is still open, but giving $100,000 to Paley Studios to make another abstract sculpture, another abstract Paley sculpture, which we have a dozen of around the city, and most of the money stays within Paley Studios, instead of being more widely distributed to a wider variety of artists.
Yeah, and without a doubt, Amanda, like, we've talked about one of our objectives here, not just being, let's get more public art out there, but also in the process of developing that public art, can we find ways to raise up new artists and invest in younger people and invest in people of color to build capacity and raise up that community even more through the process. So I think that we always have to keep our eye on that for opportunities. And so am I hearing you right, that you would consider, or you would lean towards an RFP for the other 100, or for in both cases to kind of get to that point?
I want Wall Therapy to get money. I would like Wall Therapy to have 100,000.
Yeah.
I think that they have a proven track record of doing a great job. I think for the other 100,000, we could be selling ourselves short by not doing an RFQ or an RFP, especially because we don't have to hit a June deadline for getting that money out of the city's pocket. It's better off if we take the time to cultivate relationships with artists, because doing that application process isn't just potentially exposing us to folks and organizations that we were unfamiliar with previously, but it also gives us a chance to get a better understanding of what folks and organizations might even be interested. And then we could work in the future on cultivating a long-term relationship with those people.
Mm-hmm.
So even if we don't award them money now, it could be the kind of situation where we cultivate a relationship with them, and then next year or the year after that, we award them money.
Yeah. So I'll take a step even further, an idea that we've talked around internally, because on the capital side of things that rolls over year to year and doesn't expire, although we got to do it within, I don't know, 3 or 5 years or whatever, but we don't have that time pressure. We would even entertain, let's say we did an RFP for that other 100, the non-mural part of it. We would even entertain that RFP, including the following year's chunk of capital money. So hypothetically 100 and 100. This year's 100, next year's 100, or whatever split this group recommends for capital versus operating. And that way you're only doing it once. And it's a little bit of a bigger pot of money for whoever we work with to administer some contracts with different artists. So that's a possibility as well, as to get into the next fiscal year with that RFP process.
I have no problem with that, because then, especially if we're thinking about works that are being done on city roads, and we're thinking about lighting sculptures even, as a possible thing. Those are the kinds of things that would require a lot of funds to get done, and then maintenance funds as well. So having that all written in could take a couple of years worth of distribution of funds, but it could be the kind of thing that's really cool for the city that wouldn't be done otherwise, because if you're only have $30,000 available, you're not going to put up a block long light sculpture.
Sort of the way we were talking about it as well, Amanda, along those lines, that maybe there's a contractor that it helps to be the intermediary to administer the small entities, the small projects, excuse me. And then there are one or two bigger projects like what Kevin's talking about, what you're talking about, that maybe in those ways, this committee is more involved, or the art commission, eventual art commission is involved as the, you know, the administrator, the jurors, selecting a jury panel or what have you. They're more hands-on with that larger project, but the smaller ones are distributed out through an intermediary like Wall Therapy to kind of achieve that small projects and a couple big flagship projects.
But we're not going to get a good grasp on what people even think they're capable of doing unless we actually open it up to broad public communication, which would be through an RFP or an RFQ. What I would really like to see is the city host a couple of sessions, both in English and in Spanish, on how to apply for an RFP or an RFQ, whatever the process is that we decide and settle on. I would love to see some guidance come down from this, because again, if we're talking with artists, maybe an arts organization has a person who's used to filling out grants and doing those kinds of things and running through that kind of paperwork. But on average, most artists aren't going to, as someone who teaches grant writing, I know for a fact that artists just don't know how to navigate that kind of stuff. And they're gonna see RFP and like, I don't even know what that acronym stands for, forget this shit, I'm done. And we could be losing opportunities. So
here's something, and I know that it has to do with staff and various other things. Trying to piggyback, playing off of what you said, Amanda. You know, this sort of this educational moment. I think and I know the city doesn't have staff to pull this off, but I think if we could figure out a way to have this educational moment for not artist organizations. For lack of a better term, screw them. We need social service networks. We need people that are actually creative and doing things that, I'm not saying screw them, forgive me, but I'm saying if our reach is trying to reach, you know, if our reach is trying to reach, let's actually reach. I was one of those dudes sitting in social service. And if somebody would have told me there was art going on or something happening, I would have loved that. But if we can build this sort of educational system, so we're educating other entities outside of just arts organizations, we're going to keep getting the same folks for the same things if we keep reaching the same pots. So I don't know how we do this. You know, the city travels around, talks about zoning, talks about other things, and I know you don't have staff, Kevin. Trust me on that.
Yeah, no, Sean, I think we should always stay open and look for ways to be creative in who we're trying to reach. We definitely want to reach the current arts community, the up and coming arts community, but then also folks that, like you've been saying all along, wouldn't necessarily think of themselves as artists, but when given the proper training and the resources, they could actually create something really amazing. So let's always be thoughtful of like ways that we can reach folks like that. But in the meantime, so in terms of this RFP, Johanna, let me just double check something with you. I think you were getting at this with your question to Blue. If Wall Therapy, in fact, they're the obvious game in town, but they're not the only game in town that could administer a mural program, does that, by city policies and protocols, force us to do an RFP for, let's say, just that $100,000, or is there a path to just pick them?
You know what? I'm not going to give. You know, I'm going to do an attorney wiggle answer, right? You know, Blue was worrying me a little bit with some of the comments he made, but then I was actually thinking about the fact that our policy technically applies to contracts over 35,000. And this is money that isn't, I mean, Wall Therapy isn't getting 35,000 for their services. So, and let me think about that and let's talk about that, because the concern, of course, that I have is that RFP process takes a couple of months. But let me think about that and talk some more. So I'm not going to give you an answer.
Okay, no, I totally understand. And so just so other folks are aware, we talked conceptually internally that if we were to, hand over the reins of $100,000 to an organization like Well Therapy, obviously they should be paid for their work to administer a mural program. So how much of the 100 would that be? We talked about past experience that might be in the neighborhood of 10% of the funds. So let's just, for the sake of round numbers and discussion, let's just say Well Therapy gets $10,000 to administer the remaining $90,000 of that 100. Okay, just for sake of numbers, that $10,000 is quite a bit less than $35,000. So we're not giving Well Therapy 100. In that scenario, we're paying them in a contract $10,000 to manage $90,000. So there might be a path there, and we'll await Johanna's final ruling on that. If the group wants to do it this way, there might be a path to just select Well Therapy outside of an RFP. And then I think Amanda and others are making some great points that we will consider the remaining $100,000 be done in an RFQ or an RFP process. And there's not a huge rush on that. So we could get the wheels going on that. And that would be more open, transparent, and you all could consider recommending that it's not just that $100,000 from this year, but it's X number of dollars from the following fiscal year as well, so that we only have to do that once. So I think that's on the table as well. What do people think about that scenario?
Oh, sounds good to me. I want to, at the risk of, not at the risk, but I want to broach something, I guess, with Rena on the call here and me representing ROCO. We represent organizations that could conceivably be part of that conversation. So I don't know how and when we're going to approach that. If there were an open RFP from the city, ROCO might be interested in applying for that. And I wanted to just, be open with that and where and when we have to address that. Kind of not self-dealing, but the risk of, that risk of appearing as a, conflict of interest type thing, as Rena and I are both here to help design and offer advice on this. I don't know if Rena, if you've even thought about Black Box in this way, but that down the road, we could approach that whenever. But I also wanted to just offer up, ROCO to be a part of that conversation. We're in the midst right now of an RFP process. We're down to finalists and we're administering that for someone else's property. So if this becomes an educational opportunity to, put on a dog and pony show and go around to help artists learn about the RFP process, we're right in the midst of that. And I would be happy for ROCO to be a part of, explaining it from our process and our experience, and or, offering guidance and help and whatever.
Good.
Yeah, Blue, I definitely have been thinking about this too. I think it was something I broached to Sean and Annette and Thomas in the beginning. I'm hoping that I'm not, participating. I want to be really clear. I'm also still, I consider myself an advocate for the Northeast Quadrant and Joseph Avenue, and I think I've been pretty transparent about that. So I'm I don't know if I think the question more is posed toward the whole group, as well as whatever guidelines we're bound by in creating, in the creation of this group, whether there's any conflict of interest. I think we all have an interest in public art in our city, so I don't see my conflict. I don't see the conflict. So I'm hoping it doesn't exist. Yeah.
I mean,
and Blue, also, I'd love to. I would work with you on that, on the having folks learning a little bit more about creating RFPs. But I'm most interested in how do we reimagine that process and make it less intensive for artists and grassroots. And that's something that even Simeon and I have been talking a lot about at RACF, about how do we really make sure that folks have the capacity to actually apply for these kinds of things.
So we'll have to, Johanna, we'll have to have a conversation with you and others in your department about that sort of issue of conflicts of interest. I'll just say, we definitely have some cautions and concerns there, optics at a minimum. I don't think, based on how any of you are engaging this conversation, I don't think any of you are, steering this in a way so that you can financially benefit in terms of just casual conversation here. However, our standard as city officials is obviously higher than, just my sense of the conversation, right? It has to be higher than that. And so it is entirely possible that we would have to, that there is a conflict of interest there, which would mean that you would either not be able to apply, or you would have to, back out from participation in this group. So Johanna and I will explore that and see what sort of legal standard would apply in this unique situation. But I appreciate both of you being forthcoming about that. Yeah, obviously there's capability there, right?
Yeah, totally. We got to throw those things on the table. And then also probably for Amanda and I, we're both involved with Rock Arts United. Depending on how this looks, that's a volunteer organization and we're really like board members, as it were. Is that another possible entity that could be an administrator of some part of this, and how it works at the board level, which is, a different kind of, perceived conflict here.
Right. Yeah, it's a little bit different, right? Okay. All right, so it sounds like this group is comfortable moving forward with the $100,000 through an RFP process. And we will look into the possibility of selecting wall therapy, or if in fact a mural program needs to be an RFP process as well. We'll look into that and get back to you. Sounds like the group's comfortable with that. Can I also ask, I know Amanda chimed in, anybody else want to chime in on the idea of the non-mural program extending into next year's funds, which, keep in mind, would in effect be kind of part of your decision about the split between capital and operating. So for example, if you said next fiscal year, we want another 100 on the capital side to go with this contract, that means the remaining 136 would be operating funds would need to be spent that year. So you all can have some influence on that, on those numbers and the split there. And we're probably don't have enough time to make that decision, but anybody have any general thoughts on that approach?
I just want to throw out too the possibility that even if the group were to say 100 from next year to be part of this RFP, it doesn't necessarily mean that the rest would be non-capital. They could say an additional part of that will be capital and non-capital. So yeah.
Good point. Yeah.
I'm in favor of giving us a little more time so we can have a more open process with that other 100,000 from this year, since we don't have the time crunch. So whether we bundle it together or what I think we can figure that out in the future, but I think being more open in the process is a good thing. So.
Okay. Everyone okay with that approach? So we don't have to decide right now. We can, as Chris points out, we can make the decision about additional money, and the sort of split with operating funds could be a future meeting. But in general, it sounds like we want to do an RFP for that piece of it, or an RFQ. You're on mute, Blue.
Sorry. That's a RFQ or RFP for an organization to administer it, or it's an RFQ that this group would organize for said larger artwork?
I think it's the former, I think, is what we're leaning towards, to an organization to administer it.
Got it.
Okay, great. All right, we're right at time here. So I know we have some other things we want to get into with the the application process, but I think this conversation is influencing what that application could look like. So we could circle back to that soon. So stay tuned for a follow-up meeting for the subcommittee. And there's also a subcommittee meeting for the Creative Community Empowerment Plan, which some of you are a part of as well. Any final thoughts or questions before we wrap it up? All right, great. Good progress today. Thanks, everybody. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.